Hey there guys, today I wanted to talk about time attack cars. Now, this is not a video intending to necessarily shit on front wheel drive time attack cars, but just to bring up the fact that there's a lot of differences between what you see people doing with front wheel drive cars and rear wheel drive cars. I don't quite know why, but it kind of seems like the most advanced time attack cars in the world right now are either rear wheel drive or all wheel drive. This could just be a popularity choice, or maybe just because they're easier to modify and turn into time attack weapons, but I think the front wheel drive scene is lagging behind rear wheel drive and all wheel drive by a bit. Now, I'm going to go over some of the differences you see between the platforms, the challenges and build considerations when building a front wheel drive car, and then kind of talk about how I think they could catch up. Now, of course, I'm no aerodynamicist, I'm no time attack professional, I'm just someone with an opinion. But I've been looking to build up my front wheel drive race car, and so I've been trying to research and learn from the best, and I just wanted to share a bit of what I learned. Without further ado, let's dive in. For our rear wheel drive car here, we're going to be taking a look at under Suzuki's S15. This is definitely one of the most famous time attack vehicles, and it's won a number of medals, set a number of records, specifically at Scuba Circuit in Japan. And we're going to be taking a look at a few different generations of the car. You know, it's always getting changes every single year. But we're going to go through and kind of highlight some of the different, modifications that have been done to it to make it such a champion-winning car. And then we're actually going to talk about how a lot of the modifications that were done to these rear-wheel drive time attack platforms actually can't be done to front-wheel drive cars. And the most basic place to start is the engine bay. In this photo of under Suzuki's S15, you can see a number of interesting time attack focused modifications that have been made. The front crash support structure is basically completely removed. You can see that there's no hood latch, even hood pins seem like they're much further down in the bonnet than any stock latching location. The entire front bumper, fenders, and even lower window trim and hood are all made out of carbon fiber. You can see the front wheel arches have been cut and welded. There's been additional room made for, intake and turbo piping. And overall, this is just a very dialed in engine bay. It's been highly modified to fit exactly what needs to fit. One of the most interesting modifications here is actually the V-mount radiator setup. So with the intercooler in vehicle's radiator, you can actually see that it's laying flat across the engine bay. And that is carbon fiber ducting that's been piped around that intercooler in order to force the air up and out of the hood instead of potentially heating up the engine bay with what is now hot air. This kind of setup is very commonly seen on competitive time attack cars, but it's something that's much more difficult on an econo box Honda Civic, for example. For our front wheel drive example, we're going to be looking at the JDMYard X Hard Race EG Civic. Now, this is, in my opinion, one of the most competitive Honda Civic hatchbacks that's in time attack right now. There's obviously the Vibrant Honda Civic as well, but with that being a larger platform that isn't really a hatchback, it doesn't really dive into the same concerns and considerations that I'd like to discuss for small economy Honda Civics in particular. Now, if we look at this picture of the JDMYard Civic taken by Narita Dogfight, you can see there's a much different engine bay design philosophy going on here. You can see we still have a carbon fiber front bumper, but there is absolutely no space for any sort of V-mount radiator setup. In the front end of a small car like the Civic EG, space is definitely at a premium. There's about just enough room here for some radiator ducting, which the JDMYard team is actually attached to the vehicle's hood rather than having it remain in the engine bay. In this other photo from Narita Dogfight, you can see how they grafted that hood exit exhaust into the hood itself rather than having it remain in the engine bay. Overall, this is definitely a good compromise. It's just unfortunate that front wheel drive cars aren't able to take advantage of that same V-mount setup as rear wheel drive cars. Let's go back to under Suzuki's car and talk about front fenders now. As you can see, these fenders have had both the back and bottom parts cut out to allow for air to escape, which improves brake cooling. Back on the Hard Race X JDMYard car, you can see they've come for a similar approach, widening the top part of their fenders, but it appears they've actually left the EG's stock body lines on the lower section of the fender. Now, this makes you wonder how they're effectively cooling the brakes of this vehicle, but perhaps maybe with their wheel and tire package, or with the size of the rotors they're running with the light weight of the car, they didn't deem this to be necessary. But I found it somewhat surprising that you don't see more front wheel drive cars take advantage of cutting out this section here. This photo here actually comes from my own personal EP3 Civic. It's a slightly newer chassis, which may be somewhat different than the EG, but you can see here that even with the outer fender removed, there's still a large body line slash weld that comes and cuts through the wheel arch area. Now, this potentially could be hammered down, cut away, or otherwise supported in a less intrusive way by a time attack team, but again, it's just one of those features that makes front wheel drive platforms, or Civics in particular, somewhat less intuitive to turn into time attack machines. Here we have an additional photo of under Suzuki's car, showing once again that absolutely massive over fender along with the bottom half being cut out to increase airflow around the brakes. You can see on the S15 they've actually modified this wheel arch, taping over the back area that would restrict airflow or catch the air normally, allowing for a smoother transition of the air out of the wheel well. Here we have a slightly newer photo of under Suzuki's car where you can see the same thing. Some slight changes have been made to the fender, but once again, tape has been added to make that smooth transition to the door area to help evacuate air from that wheel well. Okay, now we're getting into the big boy areas. Let's talk rear aero. On rear-wheel drive cars, one of the most popular recent trends has been cutting out entire sections of the trunk in order to fit massive rear diffusers to allow air to escape from underneath the vehicle, increasing downforce. On front-wheel drive cars, we just haven't seen these same levels of development. If we look back at the JDMYard Civic, you can see they do have a diffuser on the car, but it appears to lack strakes in the center to direct airflow. On this additional photo of the Civic, you can see that the rear diffuser appears to also simply be a flat panel angled up from the rear axle, rather than something curved with enhanced aerodynamic properties. This highlights some of the competitive differences between current generation time attack Honda Civics and front-wheel drive platforms and those competing in rear-wheel drive competition. Now, of course, that being said, it's not all about having the world's largest rear diffuser. You can see here on the Escort Evo, one of the most famous time attack vehicles going around Scuba, that the vehicle actually has a relatively small diffuser. It looks much more similar to the JDMYard diffuser than it does under Suzuki's. Despite this, it's possible that under Suzuki's aerodynamic package has actually been more developed than the Escort Evo. The jury's out, and I will admit I'm not an aerodynamicist, so I couldn't tell you which is factually better, but I do find this to be one large difference between front-wheel drive time attack platforms and rear-wheel drive time attack platforms. And finally, this isn't quite aerodynamics, but let's talk about hood venting. You can see here on the JDMYard Evo, they've got one main big hood vent up front. They've got some bumped up vents in the back and then some kind of lower vents off to the sides. This is probably the most advanced front wheel drive hood venting that I've seen on a time attack car, which is somewhat unfortunate to be honest. As we showed on under Suzuki's car, it's very common for rear-wheel drive platforms to take advantage of radiator ducting such as the carbon fiber ducting around the V-mount radiator setup on under Suzuki's S15. In addition, if you look at the hood of his S15, even back in this 2013 article, it was directing hot air up and out of the engine bay, it was venting air directly out of the radiator in front, and it utilized a full carbon construction from front to back. If you take a look at other examples of full race car front aerodynamic ducting for passing air through radiators or out hoods, these time attack designs seem somewhat simplistic. Now granted, the JDMYard car does have that venting grafted into the hood as previously shown, but overall it's a relatively small amount of ducting for what is otherwise a very highly performant car. And that's not to say these teams haven't tried either. On front wheel drive cars like the Honda Civic, you just simply don't have the same amount of engine bay room to play around with. There isn't a lot of room to add additional ducting to front bumpers or in the engine bay to route air around, as they are very small economy hatchbacks. Here's another example of a R32 GTR that's receiving the ducting treatment. You can see how they have that carbon ducting pushed right up to the front of the engine, as with a rear-wheel drive engine configuration, you don't have to worry about having room for the intake manifold there. Now, let's talk exhausts. On some extremely competitive time attack vehicles, you'll actually see the exhaust come out of one of the vehicle's doors. They do this so that exhaust piping doesn't have to be run down near carbon fiber under trays or other delicate components, and can instead be ejected from the vehicle as soon as possible. On some older race vehicles, such as these Honda City Turbo 2s, they actually used side exit exhausts in a similar fashion. The only difference was they exited under the car due to racing regulations at the time. On this picture of under Suzuki's car from 2014, you can actually see how they routed the exhaust right out the passenger door of the vehicle. Now, by comparison, going back to the hard race JDMYard EG, you can see they're actually running a fairly long exhaust pipe all the way out to the rear of the vehicle. Now, I don't know if this was due to packaging concerns, racing regulations, or some other unknown reason, but this is a lot of extra weight on an otherwise extremely competitive car. Now, of course, I'd be remiss to not discuss the Vibrant Civic. This thing is definitely a weapon on track. You can see they're taking full advantage of rear diffusers, they have a large rear wing on the vehicle, and most of the body panels have been replaced with carbon, from what I know. You can even see in some photos that they've tipped the intercooler and radiator package forward in order to better take advantage of the hood vent that they installed near the rear of the vehicle's hood. Overall, I think the Vibrant Honda Civic has the most competitive front-wheel drive aerodynamic package. But now, why haven't I been talking about this car earlier? Well, that's because the shape of this car almost lends itself more towards being rear-wheel drive than front-wheel drive. Obviously, the team still has to deal with some of the same engine package configuration issues. You know, this is overall a very small engine bay. They still have to deal with the room taken up by a K-series with the intake manifold mounted right there in front. And not to mention, the car is turboed and has a massive intercooler on it. That's another space consideration the team has to deal with. But near the back of the vehicle, the rear end has so much more room and such different aerodynamic properties than a hatchback that I don't quite consider it on the same level as some of the teams I've been paying attention to in hatchback time attack racing. I mean, to be honest with you, it's simple as this. I love watching hatchbacks go time attack racing because you're basically sailing a brick through the air. These things were not meant to go fast. They were meant to carry some people and some stuff and to do it cheaply. Whenever I see a little hatchback Civic ripping around a racetrack, it makes me nothing but happy. And that's why I'm so excited to see where all of the time attack racing developments go next. Whether it's aerodynamics, engine packages, wheels and tires, or even interior modifications. Now, all this being said, most of the changes I've talked about here today are offering only percentage increases in speed or competitiveness compared to their current designs. You know, something like removing 5 pounds of weight for an exhaust pipe running slightly shorter than it currently is could be akin to, you know, a driver working out for a month before a racing event. But that being said, that's the level of competitiveness that these time attack events are reaching. And on top of this, I think it's important to note that many small changes such as this, a 5% increase in tire grip, a 5% weight reduction, a 5% increase in aerodynamic efficiency, maybe a 5% increase in engine cooling, add up to an overall far better vehicle than what was starting. As such, I think there's still a lot of room for aerodynamic or platform development with front-wheel drive time attack vehicles. That's all I've got. If you have any opinions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. I am definitely not a genius on this. As you can see, I don't have my own time attack vehicle. I do like racing and I'm always looking to make my car better, so I try to learn from the best and research as much as I can into those that have come before me. That's why I've looked into this hard race EG so much. It's an extremely competitive hatchback time attack car, and I strive to hopefully one day develop my car as much as they've developed theirs. That's about it for me today. Thank you guys for watching. This has been Every Medium.